June 4, 1942 arrived with deceptive calm over the central Pacific Ocean, but beneath that tranquil surface lurked the greatest naval ambush in modern warfare. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood aboard his flagship Yamato, 300 miles behind his carrier strike force, confident that within hours the American naval presence at Midway Atoll would cease to exist. His plan was masterful in its complexity, designed to lure the remaining American carriers into a trap where Japan's superior numbers would crush them decisively. What Yamamoto did not know was that American codebreakers had already torn apart his encrypted communications, and Admiral Chester Nimitz knew precisely where and when the Japanese fleet would strike. The Japanese carrier striking force, known as the Kido Butai, represented the most powerful concentration of naval aviation ever assembled. 4 fleet carriers sailed in formation through the pre-dawn darkness: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were the same vessels that had devastated Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, and their veteran air crews considered themselves invincible. Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagamo commanded this armada from Akagi's bridge, his flag snapping in the tropical wind. Below decks, mechanics made final preparations to launch the first wave of 108 aircraft against Midway's defenses. The carriers steamed northeast at 24 knots, their escorting battleships and cruisers forming a protective screen around these floating fortresses of Japanese imperial power. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, lay in Akagi's sick bay with appendicitis, frustrated at missing this crucial battle. His replacement, Lieutenant Joichi Tamanaga, led the strike force that thundered off the carrier decks at 4:30 in the morning. Zero fighters, Val dive bombers, and Kate torpedo bombers formed up in the darkness before turning toward Midway, 150 nautical miles distant. Nagamo watched them disappear into the brightening eastern sky, confident in their abilities. His carriers maintained combat air patrol overhead, while below decks, ordnance crews armed a second wave of aircraft with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, prepared to strike any American ships that might appear. According to Walter Lord's authoritative account in Incredible Victory, published by Harper and Row in 1967, the Japanese operation combined strategic boldness with tactical complexity that would prove its undoing. Lord meticulously documented how Yamamoto's plan divided his forces across thousands of square miles of ocean, preventing mutual support when crisis erupted. On Midway itself, radar operators detected the incoming Japanese formation at 5:53 in the morning. Air raid sirens wailed across the tiny atoll as Marine fighters scrambled desperately to intercept the attackers. Captain Cyril Simmerd, Midway's commander, knew his obsolete Brewster Buffaloes stood little chance against the legendary Zeros, but they launched anyway, climbing hard toward the approaching armada. The first Marine fighter intercepted the Japanese formation at 6:16, and within minutes the sky erupted into swirling dogfights. Zeros ripped through the American defenders with devastating efficiency, shooting down 15 of 26 Marine fighters in exchange for only 2 Japanese losses. The surviving attackers pressed forward, hammering Midway's installations with bombs and strafing runs, setting fuel tanks ablaze and destroying buildings across the atoll. Lieutenant Tamanaga's strike force returned to the carriers at 7 in the morning, their aircraft riddled with bullet holes and running low on fuel. Tominaga radioed Nagamo that a second strike against Midway was necessary, as American defenses remained operational despite the fierce attack. This message triggered the sequence of decisions that would doom the Japanese fleet. Nagamo faced a dilemma that would have challenged any commander. His second-wave aircraft sat armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, weapons designed for striking ships rather than land targets. If he wanted to finish off Midway's defenses, he needed to rearm those aircraft with fragmentation bombs and incendiaries, a process requiring at least an hour of intensive work. At 7:15, Nagamo made his fateful decision and ordered the rearming to begin. Deep in the carrier's hangar decks, ordnance crews swarmed over the waiting aircraft, removing heavy torpedoes and replacing them with land attack munitions. The dangerous work proceeded at frantic pace, with removed torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs stacked haphazardly along the hangar deck bulkheads, rather than being properly stowed in the magazines below. Aviation gasoline hoses snaked across the decks as mechanics topped off fuel tanks. Every safety protocol was abandoned in the rush to prepare the second strike. The four carriers had become floating powder kegs, though none aboard yet realized the peril they faced. Then at 7:28, a lookout on the cruiser tone spotted American aircraft approaching from the northeast. Moments later came the report that transformed Nagamo's tactical problem into a strategic nightmare. A scout plane radioed that it had spotted American ships, including what appeared to be a carrier 200 miles northeast of Midway. Nagamo stared at the message in disbelief. American carriers were not supposed to be anywhere near Midway. Intelligence had assured him that Enterprise and Hornet were still near the Solomon Islands, over 3,000 miles away. The Americans could not possibly know about the Midway operation. Yet there they were, positioned perfectly to ambush his fleet. The Japanese admiral now confronted an impossible situation. His carriers were in complete disarray, with aircraft being rearmed, Tomonaga's returning strike force desperately low on fuel and needing to land immediately, and American ships somewhere to the northeast threatening his entire operation. Nagamo could not launch an attack against the American fleet until he recovered Tomonaga's aircraft. Yet every minute of delay brought those American carriers closer to striking range. At 7:45, Nagamo reversed his previous order and commanded that the aircraft being loaded with land attack weapons should be rearmed again with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for anti-ship combat. The hangar decks descended into controlled chaos. Ordnance crews who had just finished mounting fragmentation bombs now removed them and began reinstalling the torpedoes they had taken off less than 30 minutes earlier. The rushed work grew even more frantic as officers shouted orders above the clatter of tools and rumble of aircraft engines. Fuel lines remained connected, ready to top off tanks the moment rearming finished. Bombs and torpedoes lay scattered across the hangar decks, ready to be moved but not yet secured. Lieutenant Commander Takayoshi Morinaga, Kaga's air officer, watched the chaos with growing concern but said nothing. Every man understood that speed mattered more than safety. At 8:09, the first of Tomonaga's returning aircraft began landing aboard the carriers. Combat Air Patrol Zeros peeled off to let the strike force through, and one by one the battle-damaged aircraft thumped onto the flight decks. Some had wounded crewmen bleeding in their cockpits. Others trailed smoke from damaged engines. All were nearly empty of fuel. Flight deck crews rushed to move each landed aircraft forward or strike it below to clear the deck for the next arrival. The landing operations consumed precious time while far to the northeast, American dive bombers were already climbing toward their attack altitude. Aboard the carrier Enterprise, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance had launched his attack at 7:02 in the morning, despite his ships being at the extreme edge of their aircraft's combat radius. Spruance understood that timing mattered more than perfect positioning. If he waited to close the distance, Nagamo might detect his carriers and strike first. Better to launch immediately with every available aircraft and trust his pilots to find the enemy. Enterprise and Hornet together hurled 116 aircraft toward the reported Japanese position, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighter escorts all forming up before turning southwest toward Destiny. The American formation did not fly as a coordinated unit. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, leading Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8, disagreed with the assigned search course and turned his 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers toward a different heading, one he believed would intercept the Japanese carriers. His pilots followed him without question, their obsolete aircraft laboring under the weight of their Mark 13 torpedoes. Behind them, the dive bomber squadrons climbed higher, searching the empty ocean for any sign of the enemy. The fighter escorts struggled to maintain formation while managing their limited fuel supplies. The American attack, launched with such urgency, now scattered across hundreds of square miles of empty Pacific waters. At 9:20, Waldron's intuition proved correct when his squadron spotted the Japanese carriers far below. The four flat tops steamed in formation, their escorting ships spread around them like protective wolves. Waldron's Devastators were alone, without fighter cover or dive bomber support, facing the most powerful concentration of anti-aircraft defenses in the Pacific. Every man in Torpedo 8 understood they were flying into a death trap, but not one hesitated. Waldron led them down toward the waves, beginning their torpedo runs from wavetop height as doctrine demanded. The slow, vulnerable devastators plodded toward the carriers at barely 100 knots, perfect targets for the Zeros diving to intercept them. A Japanese combat air patrol tore into the American torpedo bombers with savage efficiency. Zero after Zero made slashing attacks, their 20mm cannons ripping through the devastator's thin aluminum skin. One by one, Waldron's aircraft tumbled into the sea, trailing fire and smoke. Some exploded in mid-air when bullets found their fuel tanks. Others crashed intact but sank within seconds. Waldron himself died in the opening moments of the attack, his aircraft shot to pieces before he could launch his torpedo. His pilots pressed on without him, each man knowing his death was inevitable yet continuing the attack anyway. Within 6 minutes, all 15 devastators of Torpedo Squadron 8 had been shot down. Only one man, Ensign George Gay, survived, floating in the ocean amid the wreckage of his squadron, watching what happened next from his front row seat in history. At 9:40, Enterprise's Torpedo Squadron 6 arrived and began their attack from the southeast. Like Waldron's men, they found themselves alone and facing the full fury of Japanese defenses. 10 of their 14 aircraft were shot down without scoring a single hit. Minutes later, Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3 attacked from the northeast, losing 10 of 12 aircraft. Within the span of less than an hour, 41 American torpedo bombers had been destroyed, their crews dead or dying in the Pacific swells. Not one torpedo had struck home. The Japanese carriers steamed on, apparently invincible, their combat air patrol triumphant and their anti-aircraft gunners jubilant. Aboard Akagi, Vice Admiral Nagamo finally received confirmation that his aircraft were fully armed and ready to launch. The 4 carriers began turning into the wind at 10:20, preparing to send their strike force toward the American fleet. On the flight decks, pilots climbed into their cockpits while plane handlers made final preparations for launch. In just minutes, over 100 Japanese aircraft would thunder off the carrier decks and turn northeast, carrying enough firepower to obliterate the American carriers. Everything seemed to be falling into Nagamo's favor. His ships had survived 3 separate torpedo attacks without suffering any damage. American naval aviation appeared far less capable than intelligence had suggested. The path to victory lay clear ahead. What Nagamo did not know was that high above his fleet, 37 Douglas SBD, dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown had finally found their targets. The Japanese carriers lay spread below them, their flight decks packed with armed and fueled aircraft, their hangars crammed with bombs and torpedoes, their combat air patrol down at sea level after massacring the American torpedo bombers. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bombers, had nearly given up his search when he spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northeast at high speed. Following that ship had led him directly to Nagamo's carriers. At 10:22, McCluskey pushed over into his attack dive, followed by his squadron mates. The dauntless dive bombers screamed down through 7,000 feet of empty air, their perforated dive brakes howling. Japanese lookouts spotted them far too late. Some anti-aircraft guns swung skyward, but most of the combat air patrol remained at low altitude, having just finished destroying the torpedo bombers. The carriers began evasive maneuvers, but ships traveling at 24 knots cannot turn quickly. In the cockpits of the plunging dive bombers, American pilots steadied their aim, waiting for the perfect moment to release. McCluskey's first section targeted Kaga. The lead pilot released at 2,000 feet, his 1,000-pound bomb arcing down toward the carrier's massive flight deck. The weapon struck near the forward elevator, penetrating into the hangar deck before exploding among the armed and fueled aircraft waiting there. The detonation triggered a chain reaction as aviation gasoline ignited and bombs began cooking off. Within seconds, the entire forward section of the hangar was an inferno. More bombs followed, one striking aft near the island structure, another hitting amidships. Each explosion spawned new fires that raced through the ship, feeding on the carelessly stored ordnance and fuel. 3 miles away, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led Yorktown's dive bombers against Soryu. Leslie's bomb struck the carrier's flight deck just forward of the midship elevator, and like Kaga, Soryu's interior erupted into flames. 2 more bombs followed, turning the carrier into a floating pyre. On Soryu's bridge, Captain Raisaku Yanejimoto watched helplessly as fires consumed his ship. All power failed within minutes. Communications went dead. Fire-fighting equipment proved useless against the intense blazes spreading through the hangar decks. Within 20 minutes of the first bomb hit, Soryu had become an uncontrollable inferno, her crew abandoning ship. McCluskey's remaining sections dove on Akagi Nagamo's flagship. Only one bomb struck home, hitting near the amidships elevator, but that single hit proved catastrophic. The bomb penetrated to the hangar deck where it detonated among the rearmed aircraft waiting to launch. Fuel lines ruptured, spraying aviation gasoline across hot metal. Torpedoes that had been hastily stacked along the bulkheads exploded in sympathy detonations. Within minutes, Akagi's entire hangar deck had become an impassable wall of flame. Captain Taijiro Ozero Aoki ordered all hands to fight the fires, but nothing could control the conflagration. The fires reached the ship's fuel storage tanks, triggering massive secondary explosions that buckled the flight deck. Vice Admiral Nagamo stood on Akagi's bridge, watching flames consume his flagship while around him officers shouted frantic damage reports. The situation aboard all three stricken carriers had deteriorated from critical to catastrophic in mere minutes. Akagi's fires prevented any access to the hangar deck, trapping hundreds of men below in the spreading inferno. Communications with the fleet had failed as antenna cables burned through. The admiral's staff urged him to transfer his flag to another ship, but Nagamo seemed paralyzed by the magnitude of the disaster unfolding around him. In 5 minutes of devastating American bombing, 6 months of Japanese naval superiority had evaporated like morning mist. Captain Aoki finally convinced Nagamo to abandon the burning flagship. Officers helped the admiral down to the flight deck, now warped and buckling from fires below, then down rope ladders to the destroyer Naoki waiting alongside. As Nagamo descended, he could see Kaga and Soryu burning fiercely 2 miles away, pillars of black smoke climbing thousands of feet into the tropical sky. Only Hiryu remained undamaged, steaming away from her dying sisters while preparing a counterattack. Nagamo transferred his flag to the cruiser Nagara, from where he could see the full extent of the catastrophe. 3 of his 4 carriers were doomed, and with them went Japan's best pilots, mechanics, and deck crews, men whose training and experience could never be replaced. Aboard Kaga, Captain Jisaku Okada ordered abandoned ship at 4:30 in the afternoon after hours of futile firefighting efforts. The carrier had become a blast furnace, her steel plates glowing red from the heat within. Secondary explosions continued ripping through the hull as ammunition cooked off. Men leaped from the stern into the oil-slicked waters, swimming desperately away from the dying ship. Destroyers maneuvered close to pick up survivors while the carrier settled lower in the water. At 7:25 that evening, Kaga's magazines finally detonated in a tremendous explosion that tore the ship apart. The carrier sank stern first, carrying 800 of her crew down with her, along with dozens of aircraft and 6 months of irreplaceable combat experience. Soryu died even faster than her sisters. Captain Yanejimoto refused to leave his burning ship, ordering his crew to safety while he remained on the bridge. The fires had spread so quickly that hundreds of men never made it off before the carrier's structural integrity failed. At 7:30 in the evening, just 9 hours after being struck, Soryu rolled over and sank, taking Captain Yanejimoto and 700 of her crew into the depths. Only a handful of her aircraft had been in the air during the attack. The rest burned aboard the ship or went down with her. The carrier that had struck Pearl Harbor, raided Darwin, and terrorized the Indian Ocean vanished beneath the Pacific in minutes. Akagi proved harder to kill, her larger hull and better damage control keeping her afloat through the afternoon despite fires that raged out of control. Captain Aoki and skeleton crews remained aboard throughout the day, attempting to save the ship that symbolized Japanese carrier aviation. By evening, however, it became clear that Akagi could not be saved. The fires had spread to her machinery spaces, and flooding from firefighting efforts had made her list dangerously. At 4:50 on the morning of June 5th, destroyers fired torpedoes into Akagi's hull to send her to the bottom rather than let her be captured. The flagship of the Kido Butai, the ship that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, slipped beneath the waves at dawn, taking 267 of her crew with her. Only Hiryu remained operational from the once mighty carrier strike force. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding from Hiryu's bridge, immediately organized a counterattack using his surviving aircraft. At 11 in the morning on June 4th, 18 Val dive bombers and 60 fighters launched from Hiryu's deck, vectored toward the reported position of the American carriers. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led this strike force through broken clouds until they spotted the Yorktown. The American carrier had recovered her own aircraft and was conducting refueling operations when Hiryu's strike arrived. Despite heavy anti-aircraft fire and intercepting fighters, Kobayashi's pilots pressed home their attack with the skill and determination that characterized Japanese naval aviation at its peak. 3 bombs struck Yorktown within the span of 2 minutes, penetrating her flight deck and exploding deep within the ship. The carrier shuddered under the impacts, fires erupting from the bomb hits, black smoke pouring from ruptured ventilators. Captain Elliot Buckmaster fought to save his ship, his damage control parties working with practiced efficiency to contain the blazes. Unlike the Japanese carriers with their exposed ordnance and fuel, Yorktown had proper ammunition handling procedures and effective fire suppression systems. Within 2 hours, her crew had extinguished the fires and restored partial power. The carrier prepared to recover aircraft, appearing to have survived the attack despite severe damage. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi launched a second strike at 12:45 in the afternoon, this time sending 10K torpedo bombers and 60 escorts. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, who had led the morning strike against Midway, volunteered to lead this attack despite his aircraft having a damaged fuel tank that would prevent him from returning. He led his squadron through the American combat air patrol and anti-aircraft fire until they reached attack position. Tomonaga's Kates split into groups to attack Yorktown from multiple directions, forcing the carrier to choose which threat to face. At 2:45, 2 torpedoes slammed into Yorktown's port side, tearing enormous holes below the waterline and jamming her rudder. The carrier lost all power and began listing heavily. Captain Buckmaster finally gave the order to abandon ship at 3 in the afternoon, convinced his vessel was doomed. Tomonaga died in the attack, his damaged aircraft shot down after releasing its torpedo. Enterprise's scout planes had been searching for the 4th Japanese carrier since mid-morning, and finally, at 2:45, one reported Hiryu's position 110 miles northwest of Midway. Rear Admiral Spruance immediately ordered a strike prepared, assembling 24 dive bombers from Enterprise and 10 from Yorktown, which had landed aboard Enterprise before their own carrier was torpedoed. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher led this strike force, launching at 3:30 in the afternoon. The American pilots flew west through scattered clouds until they spotted Hiryu steaming at high speed, her escorting vessels spread around her in a protective formation. Unlike the morning attack, Hiryu's combat air patrol was alert and positioned properly, but the afternoon sun favored the American dive bombers. At 5 in the afternoon, Gallagher led his squadron into their attack dive. The dauntless bombers plunged through moderate anti-aircraft fire, and 4 bombs struck Hiryu in rapid succession. The first hit forward on the flight deck, the second near the forward elevator, the third amidships, and the 4th aft near the hangar. As with her sister carriers, Hiryu's interior became an instant inferno as armed and fueled aircraft detonated in chain reactions. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi remained on the bridge, directing firefighting efforts that proved utterly futile. By evening, Hiryu had become a floating torch, her entire hull glowing from internal fires, secondary explosions rippling through her structure every few minutes. At 2:30 in the morning on June 5th, Rear Admiral Yamaguchi sent a final message to Admiral Yamamoto accepting full responsibility for the disaster and requesting permission to go down with his ship. He and Captain Kaku ordered the crew to abandon ship, then retired to the bridge to await their fate. At 4:15 in the morning, destroyers fired torpedoes into Hiryu's hull to hasten her end. The carrier capsized and sank at 8:20, taking Yamaguchi and Kaku with her along with 390 crew members who had been unable to escape. The last of the 4 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor disappeared into the Pacific depths, and with her went Japan's realistic hopes of achieving strategic victory in the Pacific War. Admiral Yamamoto, still 300 miles west aboard his super battleship Yamato, received reports of the disaster with stunned disbelief. His intricate plan, designed to destroy American carrier power and secure Japan's defensive perimeter, had instead resulted in the destruction of Japan's own carrier striking force. Throughout June 5th, Yamamoto attempted to salvage something from the catastrophe, ordering his scattered forces to concentrate for a nighttime surface engagement. But Admiral Spruance refused to be drawn into a trap, withdrawing his carriers eastward rather than risking them in darkness against Yamamoto's superior battleship force. The Japanese commander-in-chief finally accepted defeat at 2:15 in the morning on June 6, ordering all forces to retire westward. The butcher's bill from Midway forever altered the balance of naval power in the Pacific theater. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and approximately 3,000 personnel killed. Among the dead were some of Japan's most experienced carrier pilots, men who had trained for years and participated in every major operation since Pearl Harbor. American losses included 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 145 aircraft, and 307 personnel killed. The disparity in material losses was significant, but the true cost to Japan went far beyond mere numbers recorded in after-action reports. Captain Mitsuo Fukita, observing the battle from Akagi's sick bay before being evacuated, later wrote in his memoirs that Midway represented the moment when Japan's offensive capability died. The Imperial Japanese Navy would never again launch a major carrier operation. The skilled pilots who perished could not be replaced quickly enough to match American training programs that were graduating thousands of aviators monthly. The carriers themselves, representing years of construction and centuries of accumulated shipbuilding expertise, vanished in a single day. Japan would commission new carriers during the remaining war years, but they would sail with inexperienced crews and inadequate aircraft, shadows of the Kido Butai's former power. Admiral Nimitz understood immediately that the Battle of Midway had fundamentally shifted the Pacific War's trajectory. In a war fought across ocean distances measured in thousands of miles, carrier aviation represented the decisive weapon, and Japan had just lost the core of her carrier strength. The American naval commanders who had gambled everything on their codebreakers' intelligence and their pilots' courage had won perhaps the most important naval victory in their nation's history. From Midway forward, the initiative in the Pacific would belong to the United States, though 3 more years of savage fighting remained before Japan's surrender. The strategic implications of Japan's defeat extended far beyond military calculations. The battle represented the high-water mark of Japanese expansion in the Pacific. Never again would Japanese forces advance eastward. The defensive perimeter that Yamamoto sought to establish and defend remained incomplete and vulnerable. Within 2 months, American forces would land on Guadalcanal, beginning the long march westward across the Pacific Islands toward Japan itself. Every subsequent Japanese defensive stand, from the Solomons to the Philippines to Okinawa, would be fought with diminishing resources against an enemy growing stronger with each passing month. Japanese attempts to downplay the defeat proved futile despite official censorship. The 4 carrier captains' deaths received public announcement, though the circumstances remained classified. Families of the thousands of dead sailors and airmen received notifications, and rumors spread despite government efforts at secrecy. Within the Imperial Navy itself, the magnitude of the disaster could not be hidden from officers who understood that losing 4 fleet carriers simultaneously represented an unrecoverable blow. Some senior officers privately acknowledged that Japan had lost any realistic chance of winning the war, though such defeatist talk remained carefully hidden from military police. The American public learned of the victory gradually through carefully managed press releases that revealed the scale of success without compromising intelligence sources. Admiral Nimitz's communique announcing a major victory at Midway sparked celebrations across a nation hungry for good news after 6 months of defeat and retreat. The names of the 4 Japanese carriers appeared in newspaper headlines, though few Americans understood the significance of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu disappearing beneath the Pacific waves. Military analysts, however, recognized immediately that the balance of power had shifted decisively. Today, historians almost universally recognize the Battle of Midway as the turning point of the Pacific War, The encounter demonstrated how intelligence, timing, and courage could overcome numerical disadvantage. It showed that aircraft carriers had become the dominant weapon of naval warfare, rendering battleships obsolete for all practical purposes. Most importantly, it proved that Japan's early war string of victories resulted from superior training and preparation rather than inherent superiority, and once American forces gained experience and proper equipment, they would prove formidable opponents. The wrecks of the 4 Japanese carriers lay undiscovered for decades, resting in 16,000 feet of water northwest of Midway Atoll. In 1998, deep-sea explorer Robert Ballard located Yorktown, her hull remarkably preserved in the cold, dark depths. Japanese carriers proved harder to find, their precise sinking locations poorly recorded in the chaos of battle. Not until 2019 did research vessels discover Kaga, her hull lying upright on the ocean floor, silent testimony to 5 fatal minutes that changed world history. The other carriers remain lost in the abyss, unmarked graves for thousands of sailors and airmen whose sacrifice became the foundation of Japan's defeat and America's ultimate victory in the Pacific War. The Battle of Midway demonstrated that in modern warfare, intelligence, adaptability, and courage could triumph over superior numbers and veteran skill. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the pride of their navy and the terror of the Pacific, disappeared forever on June 4th and 5th, 1942, taking with them Japan's realistic hopes of strategic victory and ensuring that the rising sun would eventually set on imperial ambitions.